Hey, this is Mohal Joshi from Los Angeles, California. I follow Indian foreign policy and defense with a special focus on Asia. You can follow me on Twitter at Mohal Joshi.
Hey, this is Kishor from Bengaluru in India. I am an international relations expert specializing in global security, conflict resolution, and international negotiation. My focus areas include peace building and digital diplomacy. You can find me on Twitter at Veggie Diplomat. Hello and welcome to episode 33 of India Rising Strategic Affairs Conversations with Mohal and Kishor, a show in which we analyze the happenings from around the world and their impact on India. Before we begin with today's episode, we just hope that you and your loved ones are safe at home and are healthy during these troubled times. We know that the second wave in India has had a lasting impact on many of us, and hence we want to share our concern with you during these times. Remember to stay safe and stay home. The month of Ramadan is generally tense in the city of Jerusalem. The Palestinian Arabs wish to pray in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is situated in the walled old city. And fearing unrest, Israel deploys its defense forces to control the crowds who come to pray over there. This year was no different. However, what added to the already tense situation was the verdict about the ownership of land in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, in addition to the Jerusalem Day celebrations planned by ultra-right-wing parties in Israel. This led to a highly volatile situation, which was milked by the Hamas militant group in a rather unexpected fashion. In today's episode, we dig deep into what triggered the crisis and what was India's stand in the whole situation. By May 2021, trouble had been brewing in Jerusalem for about a month. A combination of Arab attacks on Israeli Jews in the city, restrictions the police placed on Palestinians attempting to gather near Damascus Gate, which is a main entryway into the old city during the holy month of Ramadan, and a march through the city by a group called Lehava, whose supporters chanted "Death to the Arabs." All contributed to the tension that had spread across Israel. In isolation, each of these incidents was not unusual. However, they came at the same time as Israel's courts paved the way for the eviction of 6 Palestinian families from a neighborhood in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah, and for Jewish families to move into those homes. The alleged storming of Al-Aqsa by Israeli police was also not unprovoked. Many media outlets chose to ignore that the protesters first hurled rocks and Molotov cocktails at the officers stationed outside, provoking them to respond with force. Perhaps the police should have known better. After all, claiming that Al-Aqsa is under attack to incite unrest has been a regular tactic of Palestinian leadership since the inception of Israel. After this was the unexpected attack from the Hamas on various cities within Israel. Rocket attacks coming in from the Gaza Strip killed a few Israelis, I think about 12 in total, and this led to widespread fear and concern within the Israeli establishment. And that is when Israel chose to retaliate. Now, the question is, why did Hamas escalate now? It is important to note that there was an election due in the West Bank, which is run by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, loosely referred to as Fateh. Now, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of PLO, he cancelled the elections. And this gave a chance for Hamas, who controls the other half of Palestine, which is the Gaza Strip, to now upstage Fatah in West Bank. While the long-standing territorial dispute of Israel and Palestine is at the center of the crisis. The co-option of the Palestinian cause over the past years by Hamas has complicated things even further. Now, Hamas thinks that the Fatah or the PLO are hand in glove with the Israelis, and hence they really don't want a complete independent Palestine. And that is why Hamas thinks that they should actually go ahead and push for complete leadership change within the West Bank, and they want to govern West Bank as well. So that is the context in which Hamas looks at West Bank. Now, what they want is they don't care about the electoral process or the negotiation process that the PLO carries out with the Israeli authorities, and all they want is to get rid of PLO completely and take over West Bank. Now, this led to Hamas seizing the moment, so to speak, and attacking Israel, simply because they wanted to show that we are the real we are really concerned that
Defenders of Palestinian cause.
and also the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Correct.
Yeah,
So
so
I
I
think
mean, there is a political angle also here that with the elections due, they wanted to upstage the Fatah, like to show them they are the true guardians of the Palestinian cause. And I mean, basically, when the next
right.
elections are held, try to win more seats and control both Gaza and West Bank.
Now the issue with that, no elections have been held in Gaza in the past 15, 16 years. So I think uh, uh,
You mean West Bank, right?
no, in Gaza, in Gaza. So
Okay.
Hamas does not care much about the electoral processes and winning them and
Mhm.
get coming to power. So I think that's something that they are not too keen about. But all they want for now is to
Mhm.
ensure that there is a loss of face for the PLO
Even in the West Bank, I think the elections have been postponed multiple times
multiple
by
times.
Mahmoud Abbas. So even
Correct.
though the elections have not been held there, and this schism, I think, uh, is like to the detriment of the Palestinians because there is no single unified leader or
Exactly. Yeah.
movement who can represent them.
Correct, correct. Okay, so this led to almost a disproportionate response from Israel. And this is when we saw the Israeli defense system called the Iron Dome in full glory. So, Mohal, you want to talk about the Iron Dome?
Yeah, so basically, the Iron Dome was conceptualized after the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. Now, during that time, the Hezbollah from Lebanon had fired thousands of rockets into Israel. Now, uh, as a result of these thousands of rockets, which were like short-range Katyusha rockets, they landed in northern Israel and they killed like quite a few civilians and almost like up to quarter of a million had to evacuate and maybe up to a million were confined to bomb shelters. So they came up with this thought process that how to protect the civilians. So they designed this Iron Dome, which is basically based off three components. It's a detection and tracking radar, a battle management and weapon control system, and a missile firing unit. So what this does is it intercepts the rockets, uh, incoming rockets. It tracks the flight path and it launches rockets to intercept them. It doesn't do a kinetic interception per se. What they do is it has a proximity sensor fuse. So once the missile is in close proximity and the fuse triggers, it explodes, negating the impact of the rocket.
Mm-hmm.
Now, mind you, like this is an expensive system, so it's not cheap, but it has shown to have at least like 90% success in intercepting rockets. So even though the as we saw in the those dramatic videos, I think it was like 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, that when they were firing literally hundreds and or maybe even thousands of rockets at the same time, the system used to light up and try intercept most of the rockets. And I think that's why the casualties on the Israeli side were as low as a dozen casualties,
Correct.
while I think on the Palestinian side, they were like almost like 250.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we all saw the Iron Dome in all its glory, and the brightly lit up skies in Israel was actually the defining picture of this current conflict. Now, let's get to the root cause of the current conflict, and let's talk about the actual vicinity in Jerusalem, the locality called Sheikh Jarrah. And Mohal, again, you want to talk about this?
Yeah, so Sheikh Jarrah, it's located in the north of the old city of Jerusalem. It's a predominantly Palestinian or Muslim neighborhood, and it was named, interestingly, after the personal physician of Saladin, the great Muslim general who captured Jerusalem from the Christian Crusaders. Now, today, Sheikh Jarrah has been home to generations of Palestinian families. So what happened is in the 1948 war that occurred right after Israel declared its independence, Jordan and other, like I believe like 5 or 6 nations invaded Israel, and the West Bank area was under Jordanian control until 1967. Uh, and in the 1967, the 6 day war, Israel was managed to recapture like Sheikh Jarrah and the rest of East Jerusalem from
Mm-hmm.
the
Jordanians, yeah, push them back.
Jordanians.
Yeah.
So what this did, it's created a kind of a legal or nightmare in terms of who owns the land and stuff. So during that occupation of Sheikh Jarrah by Jordan, uh, like Palestinian refugee families were moved into Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, and they've been living there ever since. I mean, the ancestors and even the present day residents.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and the West Bank was taken over by Israel in 1967, some of the original Jewish settlers started launching legal challenges to the Palestinian claim on the land, and there was a legal battle that continues, interestingly, till today. So the Israeli settlers say that this land was originally their ancestors' property, I mean, which was abandoned during the war in 48 and was taken over by the Palestinians. While the Palestinians say that they have been here and they have been like for decades now. I mean, from 48 onwards, and now being forced to vacate unfairly because there is technically no equivalent law for Palestinians to claim land inside the proper state of Israel, which they were forced to leave during the war. So the
Mm-hmm.
evictions, I mean, a lower court had ruled in favor of the Israeli settlers. The evictions were put on hold by Israel's Supreme Court, which it said that it would deliver the verdict on an appeal from the Palestinian families who had to uh, who lost the ruling in the lower court. Now, as the holy month of Ramadan drew a close, there was unrest at a flashpoint in the Al-Aqsa mosque, and it just pushed like the two sides even closer to an armed conflict.
Fair enough. So, again, the whole issue of who does the land belong to uh, goes back all the way to the Zionist, political Zionist movement days, when many Jewish families wanted to come over to the so-called Holy Land, and again wanted to. I mean, they ended up getting permission from the Ottoman Turks, and then the British,
Mm-hmm.
while they were ruling the while they were ruling the lands as the British Mandate of the
Mm-hmm.
Palestine. So yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
been quite a long
I mean,
uh,
it's funny
checkered
that
history.
in every geopolitical land dispute, there's always one constant, which is the British Empire. I
British.
mean, be it Southeast Asia or the Middle East, like they have their tentacles or their claws in every possible geopolitical land dispute, border dispute, whatever you want to call, like
Yeah, they knew
So
how to get on the tiger, but they didn't know how to get down.
I think probably like just mess up like when they were leaving, just mess up the people who left behind.
All they would
Anyway,
be
so
worried all they would be worried about to ensure that their interests are safeguarded at any cost.
anyway, so coming back to the Sheikh Jarrah point. So basically in 1970, as per Israeli law, Jewish property owners and their descendants could reclaim land, which was if they could prove that the land was owned by them prior to 1948 when the state of Israel came into existence.
Mhm.
Interestingly, the Palestinians do have the same right, but I mean there was never a state of Palestine, so there is also another legal complications there. So as I said before, the Israel Supreme Court delayed, uh, saying that okay, we don't want to take this contentious decision during the holy month of Ramzan when there could be more tensions. But interestingly, the some of the settler families who had won the case in the lower courts went to the actual site, and there's a like this probably now famous or infamous video of the the settler arguing with the Palestinian families, and I think that exacerbated the tensions that were already simmering below the surface regarding them having to vacate the house. So, I mean, technically, now if you go to the legal part of it, I mean, it's kind of very convoluted, but like also like interesting for a lack of better term. So, interestingly, what the Israeli courts have claimed is that the Jewish uh, settlers have an unchained, I mean, and sorry, I'm trying to recall the word, uninterrupted chain of transactions from predecessors in the 19th century, from the times of the Ottoman Empire. So interestingly, I know these guys are fighting today in 2021, but the story, I mean, if you want to really go back, it starts 150, almost 150 years ago in the
Yep.
late 1800s. So
Yep.
I mean, this is like a never ending, I mean, probably anything in the uh, Israel or Jerusalem is like thousands of years ago. But interestingly, this story starts like 150 years ago. So these uh, Jewish ancestors bought property in the late 1800s in the Ottoman Empire. Now these rights had carried over to the British mandate of Palestine. They also were when Israel came into existence in 1948, and obviously the period in question is now the period between 48 and 67 when the Jewish settlers were kicked out and the Palestinian families were settled. So interestingly, uh, even under the Jordanian, I mean, what I read on the, so what was happened is like during the 1940 to 67 period, there was something called the Jordanian custodian of enemy property. Now, as per the rules, basically, the Jordanian law was that the Jordanians could either extinguish the owner's rights completely if the state seized the title by eminent domain, or if the custodian transferred the lease, the title of the property to someone else. But interestingly, in the Sheikh Jarrah properties, the custodian did not transfer the title to anybody else. So that's the angle which the Israeli courts have ruled, that if the title never went to any Palestinian family, it means there's an uninterrupted title right from the late 1800s to present day. Now there have been some cases where the Jordanians transferred the actual title in West Bank to Palestinian families. So the Israeli courts, interestingly, have upheld the claims of the Palestinians Arabs that since the title got moved to the Jordanian custodian transferred the title to the Palestinians. Israelis, even though their ancestors claimed it, because the title got transferred between 40 to 67, they cannot claim the land. And correct me if I'm wrong, Kishore, this is the case, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So it's kind of a legal imbroglio that, because I mean, so in case if the in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood the title had been transferred to the Palestinians, like the Israelis would have no settlers would have no case as per Israeli law. But just because the title didn't get transferred, uh, the tenants have a right to uh, the property. Now the other angle is that, okay, so it's not that it's a complete loss for the Palestinian families. So what the courts have also ruled is that I believe they are called, yeah, their status as protected tenants. I think it's even in India that if a tenant has been staying for decades and decades, you can't just kick him out, right? I mean, assuming he's paying the rent, like, I mean, it could be like piecemeal
Yeah,
rent.
correct. That was the yeah, correct. We
Yeah,
had
I mean many countries have it, like even in India. But interestingly, what the courts have ruled is that the the residents, the Palestinian residents who are, I mean, the property might be in the Jewish name, but if they continue to pay the rent, I mean, technically, I think, if I could be wrong here, but they could not be evicted. But because they're not paying the rent, so they are technically squatters on Israeli settler property. So since they are squatters, they have full right to eviction. Now, obviously, I don't think the Palestinian families would be paying rent, but in case if they were somehow convinced to pay the rent, I think the court might rule in them favor that they could not be evicted. But just because they're not paying the rent, and because of whatever I explained in terms of titles and leases, I mean, uh, they might not be evicted, but just because they're not paying the rent and they don't own the property, they don't have title in their name. So I mean, they have to vacate at this point. So I mean, this was, sorry, I took a slight detour, but this is the legal real estate part of it.
no, it's quite important to understand that this was a mere property dispute, which ended up becoming a political
Yeah,
hot potato.
but I mean, many people, I don't think many people are trying to uh, understand the details, which I think we have like eluded. I mean, elaborated here.
Yep,
I mean,
yep.
they just look at it at a saying, oh, person X and person Y, and person X is kicking Y out of his home,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't care about the legal background, like what the rule is, what were the rules in the during the Jordanian time, during the Israeli law, Israeli courts. I mean, are they paying rent or are they just squatters or everything? I mean, so it's like quite fascinating, but I wish like more people took an interest, because it just becomes with their maximalist positions on both sides, they're just like saying, oh, this X is right or Y is right. I mean, I'm not trying to take a stand here, but I'm just saying whatever I learned
Mm-hmm.
over the last few weeks on this
Right.
fascinating issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. So this is an elaborate take on the actual situation on the ground and the legal implications and complications. Now, let's look at how the entire Middle East looked at all the happenings within Israel and also in the Gaza Strip. Now, the issue for the Middle Eastern countries, remember, Egypt and Jordan have already signed peace treaties with Israel. And quite recently, in the last couple of months of President Trump's administration, UAE and Bahrain signed Abraham Accords with Israel, and there were budding new bilateral ties with those countries for Israel. So all these happenings in Israel and Gaza was a sudden wake up call in terms of where the relations were headed. So again, it created an awkward situation for these countries like UAE, Bahrain, and also some of them had to kind of do some kind of balancing, because especially for a country like UAE, they had gone too far ahead too quickly in terms of having finance trade agreements, uh, uh, technological know-how transfer, agriculture and tourism related agreements, even security related deals and visa-free travel. So, so many things had happened in a very, very short time. And now UAE was kind of in a quagmire kind of a situation where it didn't want to ditch the Palestinians or ditch the people in Sheikh Jarrah, but at the same time they didn't want to antagonize Israel. So I think such countries, they wanted to play the middle ground, and they at the same time they also had very little support for Hamas and their overly Islamic militant agenda. So these countries had to come up with strong statements directed at both sides, but at the same time ensure that there would be a quick ceasefire where loss of lives would be curtailed and stopped immediately. So it was quite a tense fortnight in the Middle East, when almost even the Organization of Islamic Countries had to come out with tough statements. And they kind of implied, as always, that this was an attack on the Muslims and their places of worship by Israel. But at the same time, they didn't want to antagonize Israel as much as they used to earlier. So yeah, it was a very interesting situation for everybody. Now, at the same time, these countries also went ahead and had some strong words for Hamas, telling, if you cannot stop the violence, then we will have to stop all infrastructure projects that we are undertaking in Gaza. So that way, it was very clear that Hamas was not going to get unflinching support from the OIC countries. Again, as I told you, Israel is a friendly country for Israel, and they took upon themselves the responsibility of having, of arranging an atmosphere where Israel, the PLO, and Hamas to come and talk for a long-term Israel-Gaza ceasefire. So this was, in a way, Israel brokered, Israel managed truce, which eventually ended the 11-day military flare-up. At the same time, the goal of the summit now would be to hammer out an agreement on the reconstruction of Gaza, along with having a lasting ceasefire deal. Without the reconstruction of Gaza being talked about, any attempted ceasefire may not hold, and that would imply that this kind of a tense situation might lead to a conflict all over again. So I think that way, Egypt had its hands full in arranging a summit where all the stakeholders would come and agree for a ceasefire. Now, it was also important to note that both Israel and Hamas, actually, when spoken individually, were very clear in telling, we want a ceasefire, we want a stop to these atrocities and killings, but the other side does not want to. Now, that way, Egypt kind of had to bring both of them together at the table and ensure that a ceasefire was agreed upon. Also, it is important to note that Hamas actually has in their captivity a few Israeli civilians, and also they have the bodies of two IDF soldiers from a long time, maybe around 6 to 7 years. So I think that way the Israelis demand was that not only should Hamas stop firing rockets at Israel, but also return the civilians that they have held captive, and also hand over the bodies of the soldiers. So that way, the demands from Israel was quite a long list. In addition, the OIC continued to condemn strongly the bombing of Gaza, and also asked for a complete and an immediate stop for this kind of bombing. Now, again, as we all know, Israel was in no mood to listen to all this, and they said, we will not stop until Hamas stops firing rockets at us. And the whole spectacle of Hamas soldiers or Hamas militants fighting from, taking refuge behind women and children, or in places where they had children and women, and then kind of forcing Israel to think twice even before they retaliate and attack back at the Hamas militants. So that was again something that the Israelis kept pointing out and telling that, see, this is the way Hamas is actually attacking us, and we are sorry that children and women are getting killed in this kind of a situation, but we have taken utmost precautions while carrying out our operation. So that was the kind of tit-for-tat steps that were happening. And OIC again had to chip in and ensure that Hamas listens to their demand and stop firing rockets at Israel. Mohal, anything that you want to add to this, or we'll move on?
Yeah, I mean, you had a good summary of how the Middle East powers have reacted to the current situation. So, Kishore, next, let's come to the India angle. I know, like, the Middle East is like far, far away from India, but it would have some kind of implications on our foreign policy, which the listeners would like to know.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So again, although Middle East is quite far away for us, it is actually in more ways than one our most immediate neighborhood beyond our South Asia neighborhood. That's the main focus for any government here in New Delhi. So, and the reasons for that are quite obvious. We've had historical, cultural connections with that region for a long time. Now, having said that, having said that, India continues to walk the tightrope and tries to maintain some kind of a balance between the traditional support that it puts forward for the Palestinian cause and also rapidly expanding relation that India has with Israel. Now, the point is that although India recognized Israel in 1948, full diplomatic relations got established much, much later in 1992 under the Narasimha Rao government. Now, again, one needs to understand that India was a part of the non-aligned movement, and it kind of hesitated to extend hands of friendship to Israel. One, two, India was committed to the Palestinian cause. Three, any kind of support for Israel would mean that India would antagonize its own Muslim population. So, because of all these reasons, and also that the Soviet Union and Israel did not kind of see eye to eye, India kind of always dilly-dallied on having full-fledged diplomatic relations until 1992. On the other hand, Israel had a small footprint in India through its consulate, whereas India never had that kind of a representation in Israel. However, surprisingly, India accorded diplomatic status to the Office of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in New Delhi as early as 1980, and also treated Yasser Arafat as the head of state once the PLO declared an independent state of Palestine with its capital in East Jerusalem in 1988. So again, as I told you, India was committed fully to the Palestinian cause. So any support that Palestine wanted, India was always there to support them in any multilateral or international fora. So that way, it was quite a given that India had Palestine's back. At the same time, India also had opened their representative office in Gaza Strip in 1996. Now, when Hamas took complete control of Gaza, this was when Israel backed out of Gaza Strip, and the influence of PLO kind of waned away in Gaza. That is when India moved its representative office from the Gaza Strip over to the West Bank in Ramallah. So this kind of also indicated that we would want to deal only with the West Bank slash PLO leadership and not with Hamas, simply because Hamas by then had already become notorious as a militant organization or as a terrorist organization. So for India, it was quite awkward to continue to have a representative office in Gaza, and hence they moved it over to Ramallah in West Bank. Again, at the same time, India's ties with Israel also kept growing steadily, step by step, with initial baby steps, wherein initially this kind of relationship was kept a secret, but slowly there was this kind of full-fledged relationship between India and Israel, especially during the Vajpayee government, when we had ministerial visits from India to Israel. And at the same time, we also had Prime Minister Ariel Sharon becoming the first Israeli prime minister to visit India in 2003. Now, fast forward 10 years, and we had the Manmohan Singh government for 2 consecutive terms. But after that, we had Narendra Modi becoming the prime minister. And that brought in again a more fundamental shift with President Pranab Mukherjee becoming the first Indian head of state to visit Ramallah in 2015, and Prime Minister Modi becoming the first head of government, Indian head of government, to visit Israel in 2018. Now, in between these two landmark visits of President Mukherjee and Prime Minister Modi, India not only received Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in 2017, but also started to have a nuanced take on the status of East Jerusalem, even while it reiterated its continued support for a two-state solution. Now, this is the context, or this is the background for for how India views Israel-Palestine conflict. But the present crisis kind of brought out the inherent difficulties that were there in taking a balanced position. Now, Israel has kind of been supportive for India's needs and India's requirements ever since the Kargil war, which we all know about, and even during the Balakot strike, Israel kind of helped us by providing us the technical and military know-how. So that way, in Israel, it's not wrong on Israel's part to expect an unstinting support from India, but somehow Israel had the reason to feel aggrieved over the statement by India's permanent representative to the United Nations, urging both sides to show restraint, desist from actions that exacerbate tensions, and refrain from trying to change the existing status quo, including in East Jerusalem and its neighborhood. The Indian tricolor was conspicuously absent from the flags posted by Netanyahu when he tweeted to thank the countries that had resolutely stood by Israel. Now, what happened was there was a Security Council resolution which tried to pin the blame on Israel, and there were a few countries which abstained or not abstained but opposed this kind of a resolution, and Netanyahu thanked those countries. And not surprisingly, India had actually abstained during that vote, and hence, although Israel looks at India as a great friend, somehow during that in that tweet, Indian flag was absent. Now that was kind of a reality check for how Indian perspective on the entire situation or the entire conflict is. Also, India's response to the ongoing crisis is a good example of how a state that has no direct states in the conflict, but has a lot of multiple indirect ones, ends up balancing the various nuances of this kind of a conflict. Now, again, as I told you, the New Delhi tried to abstain and ensured that in their statement they tried to support both the sides and their cause for a two-state solution. But I think that's the kind of dilemma that India continues to be in, unless and until India talks to each of them or kind of encourages both of them to come to the peace negotiations and talk out and have a permanent solution. India by itself will continue to be caught in this kind of unwanted crossfire between Israel and Palestine. Mohal?
Yeah, I mean, it was a good rundown of the Indian angle. I mean, we have continued to maintain a neutral position in this conflict. I mean, not surprisingly, as you said, in the UN Security Council, sorry, General Assembly or Security Council, I forget which one was it, but we didn't take a position as we have done, even though there has been a pretty noteworthy shift towards more of a pro-Israel position in private, but in public, especially in the United Nations, we do like a more of a centrist position that doesn't upset anyone. I think even Israel understands our uh, dilemma. I mean, we do have a good, strong relationship which overcomes any uh, ill will towards us not voting with them, for every time.
Yep, yep, yep. So, Mohal, you want to talk about the US angle and how it handled the entire crisis, especially so because we had a brand new administration in charge, and people were wondering what President Biden's position would be on the entire Middle Eastern region.
Yeah, so interestingly, I mean, Biden hasn't reversed a lot of the Trump's positions with regard to Israel, especially within the first 6 months. I mean, Netanyahu, Bibi was could have been worried that I mean, during the Obama years, there was more vocal opposition of Netanyahu's policies, which
Mm-hmm.
were almost completely disappeared during the Trump administration. So, I mean, the problem with Biden was that there was a lot of pressure once the conflict started. I mean, many U.S. Politicians, especially from the progressive Democratic side of the House, they wanted to ban any more weapon exports to US, and some even wanted to tag with a apartheid label
Mm-hmm.
on Israel. I mean, they are like the more left wing of the party, and then but Biden managed to successfully deflect pressure from them. In the
Mm-hmm.
end, like some claim that they did managed to exert some pressure for Israel to stop the conflict, but I mean, he took a more centrist position in this. Now, after that, I think like Secretary of State Tony Blinken, like he traveled to the Middle East, and I think like he made it clear that he didn't want any more evictions from East Jerusalem, which could like further create more tensions. And also with the Palestinian side, he tried to make sure that like there is no more incitement to violence or letting violence get out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, he tried to like take a centrist position in between like the Israeli and the Palestinian positions. Also, I mean, the interesting part is that I mean, even Biden hasn't come out very strongly either in like favor or anti-Israel position. I think he's trying to like balance his thing. I mean, interestingly, if you remember during George H.W. Bush and Obama, they pressured Netanyahu to pause the new settlements that are being built in the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
But like Biden hasn't pushed back. So I think he's taking an interesting position. I think uh, he's neither taking the Obama position and nor taking the Trump position. He's charting his own course in the middle. I mean, even I mean, I know we are doing Israel podcast, but even if you look at the other countries, I mean, he's taking some of the flavors of the Trump administration and some of it from the Obama administration, and he's charting his own unique course. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how all the geopolitical rivalries uh, shape up over the next 4 years. Kishore?
Interesting, interesting. Yeah. So I think uh, I think you pointed out the interesting facets of
Mm-hmm.
the dilemma that the Democrats themselves face when it comes to the Middle Eastern crisis, especially so because you have quite a few new, young, upcoming leaders within the party who are from Palestinian descent, and they kind of
Mm-hmm.
are at the forefront of the global BDS movement
Mm-hmm.
as well. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that way Israel might feel that the Democrats are not in favor of having a pro-Israel stand, but somehow you were right that
Mm-hmm.
Biden kind of played that middle ground
I mean,
quite well.
Biden administration, I think he did want a reconstruction of Gaza, which I think Blinken alluded to,
Mm.
and they would, I think, take from other players in the Middle East. I forget, it was like Qatar or Egypt, like would provide like millions of dollars.
Qatar, yeah.
Qatar will provide like I think like $500 million something for the reconstruction of Gaza, which I think if Trump was still president in his second term, I couldn't see that happening. I think he was not very uh, sympathetic to the Palestinian cause at all. So that's why I'm saying like that the centrist position is like what Biden administration is pulling out. Like it won't abandon Israel like how the far left of the Democratic Party would do, but neither would it um, go full pro-Israel and completely neglect the Palestinians how like Trump did, you know.
Okay, so let's now kind of look forward and try to see what happens next. We have seen this kind of pattern of violence leading to ceasefire, a brief lull for a few years, followed by violence, followed by frantic calls for a ceasefire again. This is always accompanied by some kind of behind the scenes effort by the US administration. So this is a frequently occurring pattern where even the countries in the Middle East also try to help arrange some kind of a quick ceasefire. So the problem with this kind of uh, arrangement is that it is good only as long as it lasts. And every time there is some kind of a flare up happening again, either within Israel or in the Gaza Strip, the entire ceasefire comes crumbling down. And that is why these ceasefires can never be I mean, they don't have the, although they have the potential to be long lasting, somehow they kind of fail to stand up to their name. Now, the issue again is Israel always wants Hamas to stop sending across or firing across rockets, or also building terrorist infrastructure within the Gaza Strip. Now, at the same time, Hamas would want to not only win over Fatah as part of their political struggle to become the single torchbearer for the Palestinian cause, but at the same time, they also want to show to the Israelis and to the Arabs within the region that not only are they capable of becoming the political flag bearers for the Palestinian cause, but are also capable of standing eye to eye and kind of replying back to Israel in a military language that Israel will understand. So that was the kind of strategy that Hamas has adapted in the recent past. Now, this is the kind of extreme positions that both of them end up taking, which is quite inimical to the entire possibility of a long-lasting ceasefire. At the same time, we also have other players within the region, like Hezbollah or smaller militia within Iraq and Syria, who have kind of come closer and closer to Israeli borders, and they, looking for an opportune moment, would not hesitate to convert any limited clash into a wider Israel-Iran covert war as well. Now, that would imply that the whole region would be involved in this kind of a war. And again, Israel would left to fend for itself against all these enemies who would want to attack in synchronized moves. So that way, geopolitical factors are always bound to push Israel-Palestine confrontations, even in times to come. At the same time, again, the other issue is that although for Israel, the larger security concerns right now are coming from Gaza, but it does not end there. Their security concerns are kind of spread all across the region. And again, the gas pipes that come from the Mediterranean, the energy security that they keep talking about, and also their borders with Syria, Lebanon, the militant groups. All these play a role in having a peaceful or rather, let me say this way, allowing Israel to have some kind of a peaceful coexistence with their neighbors. So that way, this is kind of continued to be a mirage, and it continues to be brittle even in times to come.
Yeah, I mean, they have with the Abraham Accords. At least they have peace with many of the Sunni nations out there. But as you said, that they have a, I mean, almost like a hot cold war, what you want to call it, with the Iranians and the Shiite countries out there
Mm-hmm.
with
Mm-hmm.
Syria. So in some way, their problems have decreased with the Abraham Accords, and plus, obviously, they have a, I guess, a wink-wink backhand deal with the Saudis. Like with the Saudis, obviously, for reasons we all know, will never acknowledge that. So, which is interesting that many of these Middle East nations, especially the Gulf nations, have mm, sort of, I wouldn't say like made peace, for a bad lack of better term, with Israel, and acknowledge, some of have even acknowledge its right to exist. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I think it's like some of it's the money factor also. Like there is a lot of businesses which could be conducted with Israel, and Israel is like pretty, I mean, developed and strong nation compared to like few decades ago, with a lot of high tech industry and growing business. I mean, interestingly, unlike the 70s or 80s, when there was a romantic fascination with the Palestinian cause, I think that it has lost a lot of appeal in the, especially the Gulf nations, and uh, I mean, maybe Saudi Arabia, maybe not. So it's a significant shift that where the, I mean, also the fractured relationship between the Hamas and
Mm.
Fatah also contributes to it, that there
Yep.
is no unified cause, and even the some of the Sunni nations don't know whom to support. And I mean, it's like they don't have that support, that vocal support that they used to carry maybe back in the
Hmm.
a few decades ago. I think that shows. I think even we can make a similar case with Pakistan. Like it's more about, I think, money and geopolitics, which has taken over, versus as I said, like the romanticism of
Yep.
like brotherhood.
Yep.
You know.
Yep. I think that also is a fascinating point, simply because Israel continues to point out that there are two factions within Palestine,
Hmm.
and even if we have to talk peace with Palestine, we don't know whom to talk with, because these two keep fighting with each other, and there is no real
Hmm.
representative of Palestine people. And when somebody tells you'll have to talk with Hamas, then again Israel is quick to point out
Hmm.
that, hey, hold on, but Hamas is actually a militant group. How can we talk to them? And whereas
Hmm.
PLO or Fatah is actually a legitimate elected government within the West Bank. So that way, Israel is quite adept at pointing out the schism between the two factions, and this also kind of plays out in different ways, wherein when any other Arab nation within the region wants to arm twist Israel to go talk with these people, then again these countries don't have a clear cut answer as to who should lead the negotiations from the Palestinian
Hmm.
side. So that way, this is kind of an unanswered question, which Palestinians will have to answer for themselves. Unless and until that happens, none of them can be in a advantageous position to go dictate terms to Israel.
I mean, even if, let's say, I mean, I know they had a charismatic leader like Yasser Arafat, but even the following the movement had back in the day, I don't know, for whatever reason, the many of the Gulf nations don't have the same attachment to the cause. So do you think it's like the money factor and the geopolitics which has taken over? I mean, let's say if, yeah, even if Yasser Arafat was alive today, do you think the Palestinian cause would have such low support? I mean, when I say low support, it's not like zero support, but
Mm-hmm.
let's say in relatively lower support than, let's say, even the 90s. I mean, when it was always the talk of the town. I mean, do you think it's like geopolitics and money coming to factor, where people would say, I would rather make peace with Israel and try to conduct business.
Yep. The issue is Palestinians somehow don't accept the two-state solution in the way it is presented to them, simply because that would imply that they would not get control of Jerusalem itself and many other places. So that way, Palestinians would not even extend their hand for that kind of negotiations, which implies that the two-state solution is dead on arrival. The neighboring countries would not want to dilly-dally and keep waiting for something that would never happen. And that is why realpolitik and geostrategic realities take precedence over the romanticism of a Palestinian statehood. And that is why I think you are right in telling that these countries do realize that we can continue to support the Palestinian cause, but at the same time also have flourishing ties with Israel.
I mean, they have moved on. They have moved on because of the geopolitical realities and
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So again, one quick thing to point out is the last time there was some kind of a peace happening during the as part of the Oslo Peace Accord. In fact, it was a right-wing prime minister in Israel who actually signed that, and Israel, as part of that deal, walked out of Gaza, handing it over to the PLO. But very quickly, Hamas took complete control of the Gaza Strip. Now, having done all that, Israel would have expected some kind of lasting peace, but somehow that never happened, and we all know that this led to the popular Second Intifada, wherein a lot of Palestinian factions started committing atrocities in the form of suicide bombings, killing more than 1,000 Israelis. Now that was Israeli thing. That was, a proper backstabbing by the Palestinians.
Okay.
And that is why they think that we will not take any peace overtures by the Palestinians at face value. Now, again, at the same time, that has also marked complete rightward shift in Israel until now, which ended up with
because before the second Intifada, I mean, if you see like Labour, which is a left-wing party, was in power for most of the Israel's history, with some, I think, Likud in between, and I don't remember all the parties. But then since then, it's been pretty much
Likud all the way,
and Likud all the way, and Labour has been completely marginalized. Even though, I mean, as we speak, there is a coalition where Labour is like, I think Labour is the biggest partner in that new coalition, and we could have a new prime minister in the near future in Israel.
But the prime minister or the prime minister in waiting are not from Labour, but I get your point. It's now a unity government of centrist and left-wing parties. But I mean, again, point taken. But then the Second Intifada and the events leading up to the Second Intifada of the Hamas taking over Gaza actually ended up forcing Israel to take a complete rightward turn. So that way, even for Israeli politicians to say that we will ignore the support of the people, support of the Israeli people, and extend our hand of friendship to Palestine is something that is unthinkable, right? I mean, after the Mumbai terror attack, where you had Ajmal Kasab being caught, it was unthinkable for any Indian prime minister to tell that we will extend our hand of friendship to Pakistan. I think it's kind of a similar situation that Israel has witnessed in the past decade and a half. And at the same time, from a Hamas perspective, they would, they have been very, very outright and outspoken in claiming that they were actually the victors in this entire conflict, wherein they not only showed that they were capable of firing continuously rockets into Israel, but also stiffly resist any kind of attack coming in from Israel. And also with Israel running to the US asking for replenishment of armaments and helping them to restock their Iron Dome, I think Hamas kind of wanted to um score the brownie points in terms of narrative, telling that we managed to bring Israel to its knees. So I think that way Israel will continue to push for this kind of hardline stand against Israel. One, two, they would want to continue to claim that they are the real torchbearer for the Palestinian cause. And three, again, they would want to keep pointing out that we stopped the unification of Jerusalem celebrations that Israel wanted to do during the holy month of Ramadan. So I think that way Hamas will continue to score such brownie points whenever possible, and that is why we kind of keep our kind of not so optimistic about the peace that has now been established with the ceasefire.
Yeah, I think even in if I read the reports, like Palestinian Authority is not very well regarded by even people in the West Bank.
Even in the yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see who controls the reins of power. I mean, and one other point I wanted to make is that, I mean, we are in this, I think, very well said, like this perpetual cycle of violence and ceasefire. I mean, from the Israeli strategy where they might have eliminated a lot of the Hamas fighters. I mean, the saturation attacks that we saw in the videos was that they could that, I mean, the Palestinians, like even with a significant blockade of Gaza, I mean, even the Egyptians have blocked the border to the south with Gaza, and Gaza being surrounded by Israel on all sides, they still managed to fire literally thousands of rockets. And I'm guessing they must not have been smuggled, so they did have homemade rockets where with like stuff it is available in shops, like the raw material they were managed to procure or get their hands on are literally thousands of rockets.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, which would cost probably like maybe $100 each, and in response Israel had to fire like $50,000, I mean, or maybe $100,000 Iron Dome missiles. So this is not a sustainable strategy, because at some point you might get run out of rockets, and as the American lawmakers have been doing, that might even block shipments to you in the future. So unless you can locally produce or find a cheaper way to intercept, I mean, this might give you temporary relief, but eventually the Palestinian or the Hamas is going to figure out a way to get around the system. So this just gives you a temporary shield. It cannot be a permanent solution
Right.
where you can stay behind the Iron Dome saying, "Oh, I'll be protected forever."
Yeah. And also the point that Hamas was trying to make, that Israeli retaliatory fire has actually led to killing of women and children. And again, the numbers of 250 in and around that number. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
what Hamas cleverly hides is the fact that many of these children were actually killed by their own friendly fire, wherein the rockets that you were talking about, the cheaper $50 version, they actually
Mm-hmm.
get misfired a lot, and many of these
Mm-hmm.
rockets actually fall within their own territory within Gaza. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that has also been responsible in killing many of their own children.
Yeah, I
But somehow
mean, there have
Hamas
been. Uh-huh.
kind
I
of
mean, there.
hides that fact.
Yeah, I mean, there have been reports that Hamas did use human shields, which exacerbates the death toll, no doubt.
Mm-hmm,
I mean,
mm-hmm,
also, like Gaza being such a densely populated, I think there are like 2 million people living in such a small strip of land. So there is bound to be collateral damage. But I mean, we did see like some videos where, in many cases, not all cases, that they would be giving a 15-minute heads up warning to reduce the civilian casualties. They would be given a warning, after which they would go and strike the building. So especially like civilian buildings. So I think
mm,
the AP or the Reuters like building which was brought down, which was also used by Hamas, was a prime example where they were giving a 15-minute
mm.
warning. And in but in some cases, like, people refuse to leave for whatever reason,
Vacate.
and that increases the debt toll. And obviously the the dense urban environment in such a crowded place like Gaza would it would be a nightmare for any air force to attack
Correct.
or armed forces, which would cause in unfortunately some civilian death toll, which is, I don't know how to avoid it, but it's a sad part of this conflict, that a lot of innocent people on both sides lost their lives.
Right. Right. Okay. So before we wind up this episode, let's switch our focus to recommendations. Mohal, did you come across anything worth recommending?
Yeah, so I came across this very good article in the Wall Street Journal by Avi Bell and Eugene Kontrovich. I think it explains the legal aspects of the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and why it's been highly misrepresented by many in the media
Mm-hmm.
with their, I mean, biases, whether
Okay.
what I say is like whether they are whether they didn't research it or they maybe they whatever they read satisfied the bias. So this is a must read for anybody who wants to get into the legal aspect, which I did cover earlier in the podcast.
Mm.
So Kishore, do you want to share anything that you read which is worth recommending to our listeners?
Yeah, I actually looked at an interesting blog that was put on the Times of Israel portal. It was by a lady named Yael Leibovitz, and the title of the article was David and Goliath on the Modern State of Israel. She went on to explain that although Israel was being seen or being shown as some kind of an evil power, some kind of a perpetrator of violence, she actually kind of forcefully put out her point, telling that Israel has actually been pushed to the corner, and it is this fact that they have been pushed to the corner that there is no other way for Israel to retaliate but to retaliate with disproportionate force. And that is the only reason, or that is the only manner in which Israel can peacefully exist within the larger region of the Middle East. So I think that was a fascinating article. In fact, she kind of brought in comparisons with the legendary story of David and Goliath, wherein she said that uh, David was kind of powerless and helpless at some point in time. And you had to bring down the Goliath in front of you. But now people telling that Israel has become Goliath is actually wrong, because we don't blindly or aimlessly kill people. We actually take responsibility for our actions, and also pointed out that the enemy does not take any such responsibility. So I thought that that was a fascinating article to read. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. David and Goliath on the Modern State of Israel by Yael Leibovitz. Okay, so with that, we come to the end of this week's episode, where we looked at the complex and tense situation in the Middle East, which has now thankfully been resolved. However, one thing is certain: we haven't heard the last word yet on this. To continue hearing about such interesting topics, do subscribe to our channel India Rising wherever you are listening to us. If you are listening to us on YouTube, please press the bell icon to get notifications about new episodes. If you have not left us a review, we urge you to do so, as it helps other listeners like you in finding us. We would also like to hear from you if you have any suggestions on any topics that you would like us to cover. Do remember that these topics should be directly related to Indian foreign policy. Until the next time, this is Mohal and Kishor signing off.